Guys, let's talk Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. If you want to win, you need the best training in the world. That's where Atos BJJ On Demand comes in. You know Andre Galvão, 6-time ADCC champion, 6-time IBJJF world champ, and his team, monsters. Kay Rutolo, who got the $1 million win at CGI. Kaynan Duarte, ADCC double gold. Even Andre's daughter, Sarah Galvão, is out here wrecking black belts. She's only got a brown. Atos BJJ On Demand. It is the online version of Andre Galvão's academy. You can find over 13,000 hours of structured lessons. And I'm talking about deep dives into positions, drills that you can apply immediately. And it doesn't matter whether you're a beginner or you're advanced. This is the system that builds champions. And guess what? It's open to you no matter where you train. Normally an annual subscription is going to run you $249.99. But because I like you, use the code Chael60 and get it for just $99.99. I'm offering you 60% off for full access to the best video library in the game. Atos BJJ On Demand. This is for grapplers that win. Don't miss out. Just click on the link below. Whose wrestling is better in the octagon, Bo Nickal or Chimaev's? Now, I don't generally bring you guys the X's and O's. In fact, there's only one guy in the history of sport that's ever brought the X's and O's that isn't painfully boring to watch, and that is John Madden, because they made a screen for him where you can literally put X's and O's on the screen. You guys just like John Madden. I mean, like, there's nothing more boring than watching Madden do a football play and then he's messing up the screen. But he was the first to do it, and it worked. However, there are some very meaningful things that a wrestler in MMA must do. Now, how are we going to define who has better MMA wrestling between anybody? Well, with one way and one way only. Does it work? That's it. Not who's cleaner, and not who shows a greater variety in attack. There are multiple wrestling attacks that work in MMA, but that's only if you're doing a fine point. You want to do a broad stroke, it's a double leg. That's it. And you'll have wrestlers that do a really good job. They have a good wrestling career. They go get into mixed martial arts. They can't take anybody down. They can't take down a guy. Well, you'll have NCAA champions. You'll have world and Olympic champions. They can't take a guy down in MMA who's never even had a wrestling match. They can't do that one thing. They cannot take the guy down. And you'd have to really understand the history of wrestling. You'd have to understand some of the rule changes. You'd have to understand some of the different philosophies. But in wrestling, you are largely encouraged to control a space. So if there's no space, if there's an out of bounds and you can't knock the guy out of bounds, you still got to be able to take him down. So the way that you do that, and what you train for largely in wrestling, is to shoot to a guy. Now, shoot is the expression for we're in the open and we're not touching. Now all of a sudden we're locked up and touching each other, right? That's called a shoot. When you're going to change elevation, where you're going to cover that gap of space in between you and your opponent. But if you shoot to your opponent, which you're encouraged to do in the actual sport of amateur wrestling, it's not going to work in MMA. You have to do what's known as shoot through your opponent. Now, that definition is very simple. Where your opponent is standing, when you change elevation and you go for your shot, does he stumble backwards or not? If he does not stumble backwards, you have not shot through him. And if you do not shoot through him, you will not take him down in MMA. But there's another rule. And it's the entire reason that the double leg is the most effective technique, and in a broad stroke is the only wrestling technique that takes anybody off of their feet. And that is because you have his fabric. That is where you shoot to. If anybody was to say, where are my hands supposed to go, coach? Where am I shooting to in MMA, coach? His fabric. If he's dumb enough to wrap his ankles, those become fair game. If he's dumb enough to wear a knee sleeve and or brace of any kind, knee pad, now all of a sudden you can also attack the knee. But you must, in MMA wrestling, attack fabric. If not, he will simply slip off. If you ever want to test this someday, you show up in the wrestling room You're not very good, at least compared to the other guy that shows up in the restroom. Tell him you forgot your shoes. Tell him, yeah, I'll wrestle you, but I got to go barefoot. I didn't bring my shoes. He will not score very many takedowns, and he'll never figure out why. In a million years, he'll never piece together, oh, it's because you don't have fabric. I can only take somebody down when I'm grabbing them where their clothing is. And I have to bring this to you because if you go back and you watch Chimaev's wrestling against Whitaker, Whitaker's very, very good at stopping takedowns. Right? 50 minutes in there with Yoel Romero will prove the point that Whitaker is very good at stopping takedowns. Whitaker stopped the takedowns and even got the takedowns against Kelvin Gastelum. Like, Whitaker is really good. You're going to have to do everything right to get him down. Chimaev did everything wrong. You cannot shoot on a guy, and you will not offer me an example of any meaningful competition. Any meaningful. I don't care if this is down at your local dog park. If it's high up on the card, you will not give me an example where if a guy is further than arm's reach away, somebody could shoot and take him down. Chimaev shot from halfway across the cage. You will not give me an example of any meaningful competition where a wrestler scored a takedown. From the open to the takedown. I'm not talking once they're clenched up and he trips him and you start to get to some entanglements and inside-out trips. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about from the open to a takedown. You will not show me an example where that happened, where he wasn't grabbing where fabric is. But Chimaev was on an ankle. A non-taped ankle. Now, I admit that he did it early. I admit that Chimaev double-crossed the system by doing it in the first 6 seconds of the fight, so there was absolutely no sweat going, but either way, he shot from too far away on a guy that Yoel couldn't get down in 50 minutes who was in the appropriate space. Oh, and by the way, he went down to the ankle. That was very impressive for me. I mean, where I was watching that, and I'm, how did he do that? And I'm watching that with Coach Dean Thomas. I'm watching that with Dustin Poirier, right? We're out at campus at ESPN, but I'm actually asking him, how is he doing that? And both of them shook their heads and said, I don't know. It's a part about wrestling. I just handed a major secret away. The wrestlers won't be crazy that I just handed you that. That took 20 years of traveling the world and fighting grown men to be able to bring to you the fact that you're not going to take somebody down unless you're grabbing them where they have fabric. But Chimaev did it. He was too far out and he had fabric. But the number one thing he did is he shot through his opponent. When Chimaev went in on Whitaker, Whitaker stumbled backwards. It's the number one thing that you have to do. Number one, it's not number two, it's number one. You got to shoot through him. You cannot shoot to him. There's no such thing as a single leg. I know some people have wanted to argue with me on social media. You're wrong. Chris Weidman, Daniel Cormier are the only two meaningful fighters that could get to one leg and bring their opponent down. Everybody else had to have two. So I'm telling you that because it's going to be largely a battle of double legs. I mean, if you want to know who's going to get the other one off their feet between Bo and Chimaev, it's a fairly unlikely thing that either of them is going to do. If you put them in a pure, straight-up wrestling match, it's not as easy of a match as Bo thinks it would be. Now, if you could have either one of their resumes, you want Bo's. And you want Bo's by a lot. I believe Bo to be four-time world champion. I believe his 3 NCAA titles are world titles, considering we are the only country in the world that contests that style. I feel the NCAA championship is the world collegiate championships. So we've seen very good wrestlers, though, square off. I mean, there was a big question when Covington, who was 5th in Division I, took on Kamaru Usman, who was the champion but Division II. And those guys nullified each other right off the bat. I mean, they had all but an unspoken agreement. I am not going to try to take you down again because you are so good at defending it, it takes too much energy. They both had it both ways, and that turned into the dirtiest, nastiest war of a kickboxing fight I can remember in championship history at the 70-pound weight class. I mean, it really turned into something special, and I think that is what would happen with Bo and Chimaev. I don't believe that there is a scenario where one of them controls the wrestling for all 3 rounds, where I can take him down at will. Now, another thing that Chimaev broke the deal on, okay? He shot from too far back and made it work. He grabbed the ankle that has no fabric on it, and he made it work. But there was one more piece, and it's why the Americans have always had an advantage over the foreigners. Always. You get a good American wrestler to go in and win a world title when you can't get an Olympic or European champion to come in and even be in the hunt. And that is mat returns. When you take a guy down and he stands back up to his feet. Your ability to return him to the mat, you are only rewarded in that in one style of the freestyle Greco-Roman and folk that are contested. Only folk, collegiate, is the only one that encourages you to mat return him. And that is another thing that Chimaev did very well. Robert Whittaker got to that fence. He got back up to his feet. He went to turn and face him. Chimaev got his hands locked, drug him back down. That is something that American wrestlers do. That is something that Bo Nickal does very well. But surprisingly, Chimaev was effective at it too. So when you talk about who is the better MMA wrestler, I can tell you, if you left MMA out of it, you just asked me who the better wrestler was, I could tell you. Who's more likely to get a full ride scholarship? Who's more likely to be invited to state college? Who's most likely to be training with Olympians? I can answer all of that very quickly and tell you Bo Nickal. But if we're looking at MMA wrestling for purely what is effective, what got a guy down, what worked in getting a guy down, I haven't seen anything out of Chimaev yet that would make me disqualify him from the conversation of being the top MMA wrestler within the weight class.